New York, this is Democracy Now!
Please stand for the national anthem of Japan. The flag will be raised by the representatives of the Japan Self-Defense Forces.
The opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics has begun in Tokyo, despite widespread opposition in Japan over holding the Games during yet another pandemic surge. We'll go to Tokyo, where protesters have gathered outside the national stadium.
I just came out of a protest, and there were about 700 people gathered to protest, but there are many other protests happening around Japan. And people are protesting today for many reasons, but the main one is COVID-19. We are in the full state of emergency, and still the Olympics is happening.
Then to two women leaders arrested here in the United States this week. Indigenous activist Winona LaDuke was arrested for protesting the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota.
I've been released from jail my 3 nights for being a water protector. I think this is what you call the Enbridge way. Make sure that hundreds of Minnesota citizens are put in jail so that they can steal 5 billion gallons of water and put the last tar sands pipeline in while they put a bunch of us in jail.
And to Reverend Liz Theoharis of the Poor People's Campaign, who was arrested with over 100 women in Washington, D.C. at the Women's Moral March.
We are all too aware that the extremist politicians who are suppressing and stealing our ability to vote are the same politicians who deny living wages, refuse to expand health care, exploit immigrants and LGBTQIA people and women. And so, we march.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the opening ceremony for the Summer Olympics kicks off in Tokyo today in a mostly empty stadium, COVID-19 cases linked to the Games have risen to 110. 13 athletes are among the positive cases. The majority of Tokyo residents oppose the Olympics going ahead amidst a surge of coronavirus. We'll have the latest after headlines. In other coronavirus news, Italy has introduced a green pass, which restricts entry to stadiums, museums, theaters, indoor restaurants, and other social gathering places to only vaccinated people. Here in the U.S., Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky warned the United States is at another pivotal moment in the pandemic, urging unvaccinated people yet again to get inoculated to protect themselves and their communities. Hospitals in areas with the largest spikes in cases are warning things are likely to get much worse. This is Eric Frederick, Chief Administrative Officer at Mercy Hospital in Missouri.
You're just starting to see this in your community, and your vaccination rates are low, like ours. You can expect this to go beyond what you saw last year. The Delta variant is much more contagious. It's making people sicker. It's getting into a younger population. There's a lot less mitigation in place than last year.
Just 3 states, Missouri, Texas, and as well Florida, represent 40% of the new infections. Meanwhile, in California, Los Angeles officials said 20% of new cases are now being reported in vaccinated people as the Delta variant has taken hold. In more sports news, the NFL is ramping up pressure on all players to get vaccinated, saying teams will have to forfeit games and players will go unpaid if there is a COVID-19 outbreak among unvaccinated team members. The Biden administration's imposed new sanctions on Cuba's defense minister and the Interior Ministry, with President Biden warning, quote, "This is just the beginning." The move comes in response to recent anti-government protests denouncing the economic crisis during the pandemic and reports of government repression. People have been scrambling to cope amidst shortages of medicine, food, and other resources, largely due to catastrophic U.S. sanctions. The Cuban foreign minister, Bruno Rodriguez, denounced the sanctions as unfounded and slanderous and said the U.S. should enforce such measures on itself instead, quote, because of daily acts of police repression and brutality. This comes as over 400 politicians, intellectuals, clergy members, artists, activists, and former heads of state are calling on Biden to immediately lift the 243 sanctions the Trump administration imposed on Cuba. The group, which includes former Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, Noam Chomsky, and Cornel West, printed a full-page ad in today's New York Times headlined, "Let Cuba Live." Congress member and Congressional Black Caucus whip Hank Johnson was arrested Thursday, alongside prominent African-American voting rights advocates as they protested ongoing attacks on democracy in front of a Senate building. Harvard professor, former NAAC president Cornell William Brooks, Black Voters Matter co-founder Cliff Albright, and Color of Change President Rashad Robinson were also among the arrested. Before their arrests, the men were joined by other activists and Black Congress members on the steps of the Supreme Court, where they called for abolishing the filibuster and for senators to pass the For the People Act. This is Rashad Robinson speaking yesterday.
Don't come to us and ask us for our vote by day and stay silent where they take away our power by night. Right. We will not go back. And I want to say that there were no good old days. There is only a path forward. Right. There is only a path forward with all of us being able to be heard, recognized, and visible.
In India, over 200 farmers led a protest near the parliament in New Delhi Thursday, marking some 8 months of resistance against 3 pro-corporate agricultural laws enacted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Farmers are continuing to pressure Modi's government to repeal the laws which deregulate agricultural markets and roll back key labor and income protections. Millions of farmers and opponents of the reforms have staged multiple strikes across India since at least last November. Agriculture is the leading source of income for more than half of India's 1.3 billion population. In South Africa, the death toll in recent anti-government protests has risen to at least 337 people. Thousands of others have been arrested. The demonstrations erupted after former President Jacob Zuma began his 15-month jail sentence for refusing to testify in a corruption probe. They've since focused on grinding poverty and record levels of unemployment exacerbated by the pandemic. At least 20 refugees are presumed to have drowned off the coast of Libya in the Mediterranean Sea Wednesday. This week alone, the Libyan Coast Guard has intercepted 7 vessels and apprehended hundreds of refugees, including children, as they attempt to reach Europe for safety. Amnesty International reports that in the first half of this year, over 7,000 refugees have been apprehended and forcibly returned to prison camps in Libya. Meanwhile, the number of refugees who've died while attempting to reach European soil by sea has more than doubled compared to the first 6 months of 2020. So far this year, over 1,100 people have perished. The Pentagon says it launched overnight airstrikes against Taliban targets in Kandahar, Afghanistan, Thursday. U.S. officials say they'll continue to conduct airstrikes until they complete their withdrawal at the end of August, and that most of the recent strikes in Afghanistan come from unmanned drones. In related news, the U.S. House overwhelmingly passed a bill Thursday to provide 8,000 more special visas for Afghans who worked as interpreters, contractors, and security personnel for the U.S. during its occupation. The visas will also cover their families. The Senate Armed Services Committee voted to increase the Pentagon budget by $25 billion above President Biden's request, in a move likely to face opposition from progressive Democrats who are seeking to cut military spending. Activists gathered in front of the Cultural Attaché Office for the United Arab Emirates in Washington, D.C. Thursday to protest the planned rendition of former Guantanamo prisoner Ravil Mingazov back to Russia. He's currently being held in a UAE prison after being released from Guantanamo Bay in 2017, where he was held without charge for over 15 years. Advocates say 17 other former Guantanamo prisoners now locked up in the UAE under inhumane conditions. This is Helen Schiedinger of Witness Against Torture.
They've been tortured. These men will live with that for the rest of their lives. We owe them reparations. We need to make sure that they are in good situations and continue to follow them and support them in attempting to make the rest of their lives fulfilled.
40 labor, healthcare, and other advocacy groups are calling on President Biden to invoke the Defense Production Act to halt the shutdown of the largest U.S. generic drugs plant at the end of this month. 1,500 people are on the verge of losing their jobs at Viatris Mylan's pharmaceuticals plant in West Virginia, which will start outsourcing its manufacturing to India. The groups say the move will leave the U.S. with virtually no domestic production of generic pharmaceuticals, threatening the supply chain for essential drugs. The House Committee on Financial Services held one of its first hearings on public banking this week. New York Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who last year introduced the Public Banking Act with Congressmember Rashida Tlaib, said public banks would help support local economies and infrastructure and help combat inequality and structural racism in the banking industry. But most states and cities have to rely on commercial banks because there's no public option. This is Deyanira Del Rio from the New Economy Project testifying at Wednesday's hearing.
A public bank would be chartered to serve the public good, and it would remove the profit-seeking shareholders from the equation and allow for other benefits other than maximizing profits.
And a public bank ostensibly wouldn't have, billionaire CEOs that are paid hundreds or thousands times the amount that their lowest employees are made. Is that correct?
Yes, that's certainly our vision for public banking.
And UNESCO's World Heritage Committee has decided not to list or designate Australia's Great Barrier Reef as being in danger. Australia has been feverishly lobbying to avoid the label, which would have meant the site is at risk of losing its World Heritage status. Extreme ocean temperatures due to the climate crisis have caused the reef to degrade, including extensive coral bleaching. UNESCO's decision will be reconsidered in 2022. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Tokyo, Japan, where protesters had gathered outside the opening ceremony of the Summer Olympics. The International Olympic Committee has pushed forward with holding the Games during the pandemic, despite widespread opposition in Japan. Polls show at least 70% of the population wanted the Games canceled or postponed as COVID cases surge. At least 110 people linked to the Games have tested positive for COVID so far. The opening ceremony is being held in Tokyo's National Stadium, but the 80,000-seat arena built for this purpose is largely empty. Fewer than 1,000 VIP guests have been invited to attend. Spectators have also been barred from sporting events throughout the Games. The 2020 Olympic Games were originally scheduled to take place a year ago, but were postponed due to the pandemic. We go now directly to the protests just outside Tokyo's National Stadium, where we're joined by Satoko Itani, Associate Professor of Sports, Gender and Sexuality at Kansai University. Itani, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you start by just setting the scene for us? Describe where you are and what these protests are about.
Hi, Amy. Thank you for having me back. I hope you can hear me. I'm standing right outside of the Olympic Stadium where the opening ceremony is just happening. And hopefully you can hear the protest actually happening just right now. And you can feel the energy of the people are angry and frustrated. And the opening ceremony is happening despite, as you mentioned, the rising cases of the COVID. And we are in the fourth state of emergency. And the positive rate of the testing, the COVID testing is above 20%. So this is a very scary moment.
Satoko Itani, we're going to come back to you. We're having trouble hearing you because of the chants and the protests right behind you. So as you relocate yourself, we're going to go right now to Jules Boykoff, author of 4 books on the Olympics, who's played for the U.S. Olympic soccer team from 1989 to 91. His latest piece for The Nation with Dave Zirin is headlined, The Human Costs of the Pandemic, a Olympics. LA Times opinion piece this week is headlined, "Tokyo's Olympics have turned nightmarish. LA, are you watching?" So we'll talk about the future games in LA. But, I mean, what's happening here is truly astounding, Jules. You have Japan itself, even the leadership, opposed, including the prime minister, to these Olympics. And yet you have what we now understand is this large multinational corporation, the International Olympic Committee, that actually can control what prime ministers and governments do and allow to happen. And they've required that these Olympics continue, even if the stadiums are empty.
That's exactly right. What we're witnessing right now play out in Tokyo is unparalleled in the political history of the Olympics. And you're pointing the finger in the right direction when we think about the International Olympic Committee. The saga in Tokyo has exposed an International Olympic Committee that openly disrespects the will of locals, that brushes off inconvenient facts from experts, like medical experts who've long been saying these games are a terrible idea. And the IOC tends to prioritize its profits over all else. Meanwhile, the Olympics tend to kneecap democracy, undercut democracy in ways that you describe, with the very prime minister essentially reduced to a contractual supplicant of the International Olympic Committee with no power to decide whether to cancel or not. And you're seeing also that everything is very vulnerable to things like COVID-19 and also, I think, climate change. So when the International Olympic Committee arrives in the host city, it's this para-state type organization. But what we've seen time and time again, and now in Technicolor in Tokyo, is that it's also a parasite on the host city.
So explain all that has taken place. I mean, first of all, people might be surprised these are even called Olympics 2020 when it's 2021. And all the skirmishes until this point. I mean, this week, the head of the Tokyo Olympics Committee said at any moment we can cancel these. But in fact, that's not true, right?
That's correct. And Tokyo 2020 has actually been a cascade of calamities from the beginning. If we go back to 2013, when Tokyo was initially awarded the Games by the International Olympic Committee, then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe stood in front of the International Olympic Committee and said that in Fukushima, things were under control. This is part of the double lie that's the foundation of the Tokyo Olympics. If you are a self-respecting biologist or scientist in Fukushima at that time in 2013, you knew things were very much not under control. After all, the triple whammy earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown of March 2011 was still playing out in the prefecture. So that was the first lie. The second lie is that they started to call these Olympics the quote-unquote recovery games, arguing that by hosting the Olympics, it would actually help Fukushima and the other affected regions recover from the triple whammy disaster. Well, when Dave Zirin and I went to Fukushima in July 2019, and we talked to journalists, we talked to elected officials, we talked to people on the ground in Fukushima, they said that that recovery games mantra was absolutely annoying and, in fact, offensive to them, because they told us how the cranes and other items that would help them recover in Fukushima were actually being transferred to Tokyo. And even since then, it's just been one debacle after the another. The costs of the Tokyo Olympics, for example, have skyrocketed. In the bid documents, it was supposed to cost $7.3 billion. Today, it stands closer to $30 billion, about more than 4 times the original price tag. You've also got the militarization of the public sphere. If you look at the Olympic Stadium where the activists are coming to us from today, it looks like some sort of demilitarized zone with huge fences that prevent everyday people from getting even close to the stadium. And so what we've seen in Tokyo is, in a lot of ways, a nice example, powerful example, and, you know, of what happens with the Olympics when political elites have them come to your city. It disrupts everything, and there are long-term problems that come with it.
So we're going to talk about some of the amazing athletes, some who have pulled out. But before we do that, we're going to try Satoko Itani again. This is the beauty and power who knows what happens nature of live television. But Satoko Itani, you were right at the protest outside the Olympic Stadium, built for over 70,000 people. But it will be a fraction of that. Less than 1,000 will be inside, including the First Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden. But talk about why so many are where you are, outside protesting these Olympics. We didn't hear what you said the first time, though we did hear the chants.
Hi, Amy. Sorry about that. I hope you can hear me now better.
Perfectly.
All right. So the people have been frustrated actually ever since the awarding of the Olympics in 2013, because it was only 2.5 years after the disaster. And since then, with the neoliberal policies, people's lives are getting harder and harder. And when it comes to the Olympics, it seems like there are endless of money that they can pour into. But also, like the past year, since the beginning of the pandemic, we are told to not go outside. The restaurants are forced to close, and we are told that we cannot get PCR testing because it results in the false positives that are not good for controlling the virus. But yet, when you look at the Olympics, the tens of thousands of delegates are coming into Japan, and many of them are not even staying in following through the quarantine rules. Even the Thomas Bach, he went to Hiroshima only 3 days, right, of the quarantine. And the Hibakusha have been very angry about this, like do not use the Olympics to peace wash, do not use the Hiroshima to peace wash the Olympics. And also like the PCR testing part, if they are going to test the Olympic athletes every day to keep it safe, why they didn't provide that to the Japanese people? I haven't gotten even one PCR test over the past year and a half.
So, Satoko Itani, can you talk about Toyota? Spent $1 billion to promote the games, now has removed all Olympic-related commercials, meaning commercials that include the Olympics that are so often played through the games, because of their embarrassment that this is moving forward. And apparently the head of Toyota said these games shouldn't be moving forward.
Right. I mean, as you mentioned, the vast majority of Japanese people don't want these games, and people are seriously really concerned about their own lives. And if you look at the sponsors making a lot of money off of this game, that people's life might be at risk, it is really damaging image, right? So this is kind of historic that the Olympic sponsors thought their association with the Olympics is a negative.
What are your biggest concerns with the Olympic athletes? I mean, at this point, we see something like over 100 have tested positive coming in from all over the world, not just athletes, but staff, and those numbers only increase. A number of other athletes actually have just quit, saying they can't deal with the pressure and the isolation. But talk about what people are asking for instead.
Well, a lot of people that I speak to here, especially the ones protesting, are asking for the cancellation immediately and as soon as possible, because the bubble that they say, isn't working. As you just mentioned, over 100 cases now. So athletes and visitors are not protected. And the public of Japanese people here are also not protected. And what's really concerning is that the number of the new infection is going up quite rapidly. Largely due to the Delta variant coming in, but because of the Olympic is happening, the government has been really failed to stop that coming into Japan. So we are the researchers are warning that there will be over 3,000 cases in Tokyo alone daily within maybe a few weeks. And this is really, really serious situation, and the hospital is already strained.
Can you talk about the hospitals and also marginalized communities like the LGBTQ plus community and how they're affected and how many people are vaccinated? What percentage of the people of Japan have access to vaccines?
So we started to hear the reports from the hospitals that their beds are started to fill up, and there are actually thousands of cases of the thousands of people waiting to be hospitalized. This means that their situation or their condition is worsening fast and they should be hospitalized, but they cannot find the hospital beds to go into. And just about 23% of Japanese people or the residents of Japan have been fully vaccinated. So 80% of people are not.
Which brings us back to Jules Boykoff with this mass protest happening, even the highest levels of Japanese government not wanting this to go forward. But basically, IOC says a deal is a deal. Talk about how much money they make off these Olympics. NBC paid a fortune for running the Olympics over the years. They will broadcast. Not clear what they will show of the stadiums, since there are very few people outside of the athletes performing.
That's right. There is a lot of money sloshing through the Olympic system. It just tends to slosh upwards into pockets that are already filled. NBC gives about 40% of the International Olympic Committee's revenues. And overall, in terms of the Olympics, 73% of the revenues for the International Olympic Committee come from broadcaster fees. And I think that helps explain why they're perfectly content to have a made-for-TV event without all those people in the stands. Of course, they prefer to have them in the stands, but even if they don't, the money continues to flow into their coffers. NBC has announced that even though these games are hit with the pandemic and people won't be in the seats, this could well be the most profitable Olympics ever for NBC because of ad sales and other measures. The corporate sponsors provide another 18% of the revenues for the International Olympic Committee. And I think we're seeing a really interesting divide between the corporate sponsors right now. On one hand, the sort of long-term worldwide partners that fork over these 9-figure fees to be associated with the 5 rings, they're basically playing the long game, with the exception of Toyota, which is, of course, has strong base in Japan. The local sponsors, domestic sponsors, by which, by the way, they raised more than $3 billion from local corporate sponsors in Japan, more than ever before. They're in a much trickier position, and I think that's why you're seeing Toyota basically say out loud that the Olympics have become a toxic property inside of Japan. So there's plenty of money to be had. It just tends to shuffle to the International Olympic Committee, to broadcasters, to the corporate partners, as well as to real estate interests in the Olympic city.
Let's see, I think NBC has paid something like $7.7 billion to air the Olympics through 2032. Jules Boykoff, I mean, you played in the Olympics years ago. Let's talk about some of the people who have pulled out, like the 2-time U.S. Paralympic swimmer Becca Myers, who's won 3 gold medals, 2 silvers and a bronze. But she announced Tuesday she's withdrawn from the Tokyo 2020 Paralympics after being denied an essential medical accommodation. Myers was born deaf with progressive sight loss due to Usher syndrome. In an emotional opinion piece for USA Today, she wrote, quote, "Since 2017, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee has approved the use of a personal care assistant whom I know and trust to be with me at international swim meets because of my disabilities. But not this year. What happens if there is an emergency in the middle of the night? What if we need to be moved from one venue to another quickly? Masks and distancing have made it incredibly difficult for me to make out what people are doing or saying. If I don't have someone I can trust, how can I trust that I will be safe?" Myers wrote. She spoke on CNN about her decision.
I'm heartbroken. I can't even put it into words. I haven't been sleeping well. I haven't been eating. It's just torn me apart. Swimming is a part of who I am. It's given me identity as a person. I've always been known as Becca the swimmer, now not Becca the deaf-blind person, and now I feel very worthless as a person. And for someone who's trained for 5 years for this moment, especially an extra year with the pandemic, it just makes it all seem like it was for nothing.
So that's Becca Myers speaking on CNN. She's blind. She cannot hear. She was going with her mother, who has been her personal assistant, but they said no, that there was personal assistance there, something like for a couple dozen people, only one, something, of course, that would not be adequate for her. So she has pulled out. Jules, can you tell us more? And also the role of the Paralympics. They're not going to be broadcast by NBC Live during this time. Is that right?
Well, so first, let me just say, Amy, that while I did play soccer for the U23 national team in the United States, also known as the Olympic team, I did not actually participate in the Olympics. So I just want to be clear about that. But, you know, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has been saying over and over again, as if repeating this mantra could make it true, that the games are supposed to be safe and secure. At every turn, they said these games will be safe and secure. Well, if they're so safe and secure, then why are we seeing all these cases even inside the Olympic bubble, which, as Itani just pointed out, it's already been punctured? If the games are so safe and secure, why are athletes being forced to sign a waiver that states that if they die of coronavirus or from heat stroke, that they cannot hold the Olympic organizers liable? If these games are so safe and secure, then why did the New England Journal of Medicine come out with an editorial that just excoriated the International Olympic Committee for its preparations for the COVID-19 crisis in Tokyo? They said that they were not putting forth best scientific practices. They don't even provide masks to the people that are going to Tokyo. So it's a BYOM situation, a bring your own mask situation. The International Olympic Committee likes to talk about how athletes are first. That's one of their mantras. Also, same with the International Paralympic Committee. But when you hear the case of Becca Myers, my goodness, how poignant that is. It's just so heartbreaking. And it's hard to take that slogan, athletes first, very seriously when you hear that. And one last point on the athletes, if I may say, a really important study came out recently from Ryerson University that compared the percentage of revenues that Olympians get compared to athletes from other sports like the National Basketball Association, the National Football League, the English Premier League of football over in the UK. And what they found in that study was with those other leagues, those other professional leagues, the athletes took in between 45 and 60% of the revenues. With the Olympics, Olympians only take in 4.1% of the revenues, 4.1% compared to 45 to 60%. So Olympians aren't even getting a fair share of the Olympic money pie. And that very much has to change. And one exciting thing is that we're seeing athletes around the world begin to really come together and organize around these issues and support each other. Groups like Global Athlete, an athlete-led group that's out there fighting for justice. Groups like the Athletic Association in track and field. Groups like the newly formed International Swimmers Alliance. They're realizing that if athletes want to get more of a fair shake at the games, that they need to come together and organize independent of the Olympic honchos.
And just to say, the Paralympics actually take place, not right now, but from August 24th until September 5th. I want to ask you about the Spanish Olympic swimmer Ona Carbonell, who has criticized the Olympic Committee for imposing rules that made it clearly impossible for her to continue breastfeeding her child. While at the Olympics on Wednesday, she released a video expressing her disappointment and disillusionment after she decided she cannot bring her breastfeeding son to Tokyo while she competes.
So I had to take a very tough decision, together with my team, who's been helping me a lot, with my family, because the Japanese government's impositions are not compatible with my athletic performance and being with my family at the same time.
Jules Boykoff.
Again, another heart-wrenching story that we're hearing out of the Olympic zone. And basically, she was forced to choose between her family and her Olympic dream. The International Olympic Committee did loosen its rules after a lot of pressure from these organized athletes that I was talking about. At the end of June, they said that mothers who are nursing could continue to do so during the Olympics, but under very strict conditions where the baby would be kept in a hotel far away from the Olympic zone. And the athlete that you were just talking about, Ona Carbonell, said that this would actually be more dangerous. I mean, if she had to travel to a hotel where the baby would be for 20 days in quarantine and then travel back into the Olympic Village, that's, again, just not best scientific practices. And I think it just points to the fact that the International Olympic Committee is making athletes take terrible choices out there, very heart-wrenching choices. And I really feel for that athlete, of course, in this situation.
Finally, Jules Boykoff, the message for Los Angeles, and explain when the Olympics are in Los Angeles and what this means.
Los Angeles is slated to host the 2028 Summer Olympics, and they were originally awarded the Games in 2017. That's unconventional, such an 11-year lead time. And what we've seen since then is the efflorescence of an anti-Olympics movement here in Los Angeles, where I'm coming to you from, a group called No Olympics LA that emerged out of the Democratic Socialists of America's Housing and Homelessness Committee. And they've been fighting on the ground since 2017 to raise awareness about the downsides of the Olympics. People here in Los Angeles who are trying to bring the games, who are going to bring the games, it looks like, to Los Angeles, have long said that costs are not a problem. They're not going to go up. Well, they've already gone up. In the bid, they were $5.3 billion, and now they've been updated to $6.9 billion. But more importantly, for the activists here in Los Angeles, they're talking about how the Olympics are stoking gentrification in the city, stoking the displacement of working populations in this town, and also militarizing the public sphere. Los Angeles hosted the 1984 Olympics, that if you look back at media coverage of that time, you'll hear journalists saying that the real sound of the Olympics was a helicopter blade whirring above. And a lot of the equipment that was purchased for the 1984 Olympics was then turned around and used in the racialized drug war here in Los Angeles, because that's what happens with the Olympics. Because they're such a huge spectacle, they necessitate a massive security infrastructure. Well, they don't put that stuff back in the box and just return to sender. That sticks around and becomes part of normal policing. So you're seeing a lot of pushback. And because of the fact here in Los Angeles that they were awarded the Games 11 years in advance, it's actually a chance for activists to have a little bit more time to organize than is typical around the Olympics. But, you know, Los Angeles should be looking at what's happening in Tokyo and be aware of what could possibly happen here as well.
Jules Boykoff, I want to thank you for being with us, author of 4 books on the Olympics, and Satoko Itani, Associate Professor of Sports, Gender and Sexuality at Kansai University. We have 20 seconds. What's the plans for the coming days?
So the protesters will continue protesting, and we have to make our voices heard, because this Olympics has shown, even when we are in the global pandemic, and even when the majority of people opposing, our voices cannot be heard, and the Olympics must go on. And we have to keep saying no. And hopefully the future no Olympians will address this issue.
Satoko Itani speaking to us from outside the Olympic Stadium, where major protests are taking place. Coming up, Indigenous leader Winona LaDuke and Reverend Liz Theoharis, 2 women in 2 different places in the United States. We'll talk about why they were arrested this week. First, we'll go to Minnesota, where Winona LaDuke has just been released from jail. Stay with us.
When we become less than human, there are people who say why.
wave of young blood by Clap Your Hands, Say Yeah. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We look now at the ongoing resistance to construction of the Enbridge Line 3 tar sands pipeline in Minnesota along the Shell River, which the partially completed pipeline is set to cross in 5 places. Nearly 600 water protectors have been arrested during protests against the pipeline so far. On Monday, authorities arrested Indigenous leader Winona LaDuke and at least 6 others. She was just released from jail yesterday and joins us now after 3 nights in jail. She's executive director of Honor the Earth, her latest book, To Be a Water Protector. Joining us for her home on the White Earth Reservation in northern Minnesota. Winona, welcome back to Democracy Now! Why were you arrested?
I was arrested because I wanted to stop Enbridge's Line 3 from crossing the Shell River. I've been appointed guardian at Lytton for the Shell River by the 1855 Treaty Commission and by my tribe. And Enbridge is trying to finish this line, and along with it's now 600 people have been arrested. But we stood there in front of the police for quite a while with our people and, our horses and our children, and they arrested 7 of us.
Explain who owns Enbridge Line 3 and why you want it shut down.
Well, Enbridge Line 3 is owned by the Enbridge Corporation, the Canadian multinational that also owns the pipe under the Straits of Mackinac. And, it's a really risky Canadian corporation, 225 subsidiaries with all the money kept in Canada, and they're shoving this pipeline down our throat. And about a month ago, the Minnesota DNR, which is probably the most corrupt agency in the state of Minnesota, allocated 5 billion gallons of water to Enbridge in the middle of a drought. They knew about the appropriation request in November. In December, they began studying it, and they didn't even notify the tribes until May. And then they issued the permit in June. 5 billion gallons in the worst drought in history. Our rivers are down 50%, 75%, and yet this pipeline is marching ahead in the middle of this drought. And, ironically, you're looking here and more and more money is being divested from the tar sands. I mean, the Saudi Sovereign Fund, divested $3 billion from the tar sands, and Chevron and New York Pension Fund and Royal Dutch Shell. They're all looking at doing this. It's like the last tar sands pipeline. And Enbridge wants to shove it down our throats, and our Anishinaabe people and water protectors have been standing strong. And you got to say, who wants to be have the last tar sands pipeline? It's the end of the party. But the Enbridge way seems to be to keep pushing ahead. They've I think it's called regulatory capture, when they take over your regulatory system and your police. Because I think, as you know, Amy, the majority of the Enbridge has been required by law to pay for the police forces in northern Minnesota. Required to put in their pipeline. And, one has to ask, if it was such a good idea, why do you need so many police? But,
let's talk about the police. The Intercept reported Thursday that Minnesota police expected the Line 3 pipeline to help boost their budget to fund new weapons. The article reveals that a few weeks before Line 3 was approved for construction, Aitkin County Sheriff's Deputy Aaron Cook bought a new assault rifle that cost $725. In a November 2020 email, Cook wrote to the gun seller, quote, "Our budget took a hit last week, so that's all we'll be ordering for now. I'm hoping the pipeline will give us an extra boost next year's budget, which should make it easy for me to propose an upgrade trade to your rifles rather than a rebuild of our 8 Bushmasters," referencing another assault rifle. Your response, Winona?
That's exactly right. They've been bankrolling the northern police departments. Some of the police departments, like Aitkin County, was saddened by COVID because they had to let people out of prison or out of jail there, and losing money on their budgets in that dysfunctional system. And so, at this point, Enbridge has been financing all these northern police departments. And so you're seeing 40 different squads show up from counties throughout the state to repress water protectors who are just trying to protect the water in northern Minnesota and arrest, hundreds of us. And, it's a civil crisis when a Canadian multinational controls your police force. I thought the police were supposed to work for the people and not for the Canadian multinational, but that's not what's happening up here. The Canadian multinational has taken our civil rights clearly, myself among many, being put in jail. I mean, that's the Enbridge way. Control the police of the states in Minnesota, the state of Minnesota, and shove your pipeline through. It's so wrong from every aspect.
Winona, talk about this related to the climate emergency. We're talking to you as there are some 80 massive wildfires burning something larger than the city of Los Angeles, all through the West, Montana, Oregon, Washington, California. You've got Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake, at its lowest level ever. You've got the fires rage, in China, you've got this massive flooding in central China, which forced to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people. How does that relate to your arrest?
Well, Enbridge's Line 3 is the equivalent of adding 50 new coal-fired power plants. You don't get a tiara for putting this one in. And, so what's happening is that every day now you see the haze from the Canadian wildfires. We see our rivers are parched. But yet we see Enbridge and the DNR, Minnesota DNR, guarding hoses as they suck, millions of gallons of water out of our river to put in this Canadian tar sands pipeline in the worst disaster of a drought, and these massive fires that are to the north and west of us. It's really a devastating time for all of us as climate chaos descends upon us. And then yet you see Governor Walz decided to sell us all out, to sell out the Anishinaabe people and the people of Minnesota so he could get 23 jobs at the end of this, 23 jobs, from a Canadian multinational. It's really, it's so wrong. It's so wrong. And the Biden administration is just sitting by and watching it happen. I mean, I'm watching river after river get frackouts on them. In northern Minnesota, these are pristine river systems. I'm watching things get destroyed as Enbridge ravages through our country, and then I'm watching hundreds of people get arrested trying to protect our water and to stop the climate disaster that Enbridge's Line 3 represents. We're looking for more divestment in that. It's a $9 billion pipeline right now, the most expensive tar sands pipeline in the world. And as I said, that's like a great gamble at the end of the fossil fuel era, the most expensive tar sands pipeline in the world. And, it's brutal. It's brutal out here. I didn't like my 3 days in jail, but that's the Enbridge way.
Talk about what a frackout is, and have there been leaks?
This is a new pipeline project going in, but, they're crossing like 69 rivers, and 22 of them with this thing called the HDD, which is a super phallic, horrible drill system, the high direction drill. Horizontal direction drill. And so what happens is that they're drilling like underneath the rivers, and they hit an aquifer and they shoot out into, or they hit a beam, a seam that shoots out into the river in some spring that they didn't know about. And all of a sudden you got a bunch of like toxic bentonite, all kind of crazy stuff at the bottom of the river. And, the thing is like the Shell River is a pristine river, crossed 5 times by Enbridge, hit by industrial agriculture like RDO Offutt. And it has the largest mussel population in the upper Mississippi River. It has this huge and beautiful mussel river, hence the name Shell River. And those guys don't last through frackouts, Just the, Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Interior, all of these agencies are looking aside as Biden seems to, approve the tar sands pipeline. And
that's interesting. You mentioned the Department of Interior because it's a first Native American Secretary of the Department of Interior, Deb Haaland. She actually was at the protests in North Dakota against DAPL. About 200 major activists, celebrities, Democratic donors, and environmentalists sent a letter demanding that President Biden stop Enbridge's pipeline project like he did with Keystone XL, and to firmly establish the principle, they said, that we will move forward toward real climate solutions. But the Biden administration has not done this. Has Deb Haaland weighed in? Not only not done this for Enbridge, but not done it for DAPL, where she was there protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Yeah, sadly, Deb Haaland has not stepped up on this, and the Biden administration certainly has chained her to their position. It's tragic. There's no federal environmental impact statement on this project. It wouldn't pass a climate test. It's even bigger than Keystone. So if Keystone wouldn't pass a climate test, why would this pipeline pass a climate test, let alone the water impact? This is a fifth of the world's water. Enbridge is in the middle of, of the water wealth of our territory, the heartland of the water. And the Army Corps of Engineers and Department of Interior, no agency has stepped up to protect the waters of the people of Minnesota, the Anishinaabe, trust responsibility, nor, any of the waters of this territory. And, it's so disappointing that the Biden administration is throwing Indigenous people under the bus, the water under the bus. There's no new water, and that everybody is tolerating more and more arrests as if, that's how it goes these days. We just keep arresting people because, we think our project's a great thing. I'm so disappointed in the Biden administration, in Deb Haaland, in every agency. I'm so disappointed that they are destroying our planet so a Canadian multinational can make a buck at the end of the tar sands era.
Winona LaDuke, I want to thank you for being with us. Longtime Anishinaabe activist who's been organizing for years to block the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline, executive director of Honor the Earth, her latest book, To Be a Water Protector. As we continue with these arrested developments, we'll go to another woman who was arrested this week in Washington, D.C., the Reverend Liz Theoharis of the Poor People's Campaign. Stay with us.
New York is drinking it. And all of California is drinking it. Way up north and down south is drinking it. Used to have minerals and zinc in it. Now they say it got lead and stink in it. Fluorocarbons and monoxide. Push the water table lopside. Used to be free, now of course you will feed. Cause all tanks fill their load as they roll across the sea. Man, you gotta cook with it, baby, clean with it. That's right. When it's hot summertime, you fiend for it. You gotta put it in the iron you steaming with. That's right. It's what they dress wounds and treat diseases with. The rich and poor, black and white got need for that. Right. And everybody in the world can agree with this. Consumption promotes health.
New World Water by Mostef. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman. On Monday, more than 100 women from around the United States were arrested outside the Supreme Court as they mark the 173rd anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls with a protest calling for voting rights and economic justice. Among them, Reverend Liz Theoharis, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. She's since been released and joins us now as the Poor People's Campaign prepares to hold a Selma to Montgomery-style march next week in Texas, from Georgetown to Austin, to demand Congress protect voting rights. Liz Theoharis is executive director of the Cairo Center at Union Theological Seminary. Thanks so much for being with us. Reverend Theoharis, welcome back. Why did you get arrested?
Well, I and nearly 100 other women got arrested in front of the Supreme Court, in front of the Senate office buildings, because our democracy is in peril. We are living at a moment when 17 states have passed voter restrictions in the past since 2020, and where since the 2020, about more than almost 400 voter suppression legislation has been introduced in states. And we see the connection between this attack on voting rights and all of the other issues that impact, especially the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country. And so we were there demanding four things. One, to end the filibuster, and not just for voting rights, but for all the things the filibuster is being used to block in this society right now. The second is to pass all the provisions of the For the People Act. The John Lewis Act is not enough. We need the For the People Act and restoration of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then the fourth demand is to raise the minimum wage to a $15 an hour minimum wage immediately, because we see this connection between economic justice and voting rights. And so we were there making sure our voices were heard, standing up for democracy, because we need to do that in this moment.
What also is your reaction to the Republican senators filibustering the Infrastructure Act as the country, a whole part of the country burns and the others are inhaling it as far away here as New York from Oregon and Washington, these massive fires? The climate crisis is undeniable. That's a part of the infrastructure bill, though they have stripped out as much of the Green New Deal as they can from the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Your response?
So indeed, we need to get rid of this filibuster so that we can pass a bold and broad infrastructure bill that looks at infrastructure, including climate resilience, including education, including new water systems, that doesn't just put on communities and on municipalities the privatization of these resources. We need bold infrastructure bill, and we need to stop this moral obstructionism. That's what's going on right now. When you have a minority of senators blocking the will of the people across the board, across party lines, across geography, across race, across sexuality and gender, need the very things that are in a bold infrastructure bill, and need to expand healthcare, and need immigration reform, and need so many other things. People are demanding it, and right now we have elected officials that are blocking the needs and the demands of the people, including with this infrastructure bill.
Reverend Theoharis, you did all of this, these protests this week, just in the wake of your dad dying. Our condolences on the death of your father, Ethan Theoharis. So I wanted to ask you about him. He was a remarkable figure, a prominent historian who exposed FBI misconduct. He wrote several books that detailed how the FBI investigated political opponents, intimidated critics, and illegally eavesdropped on activists. He died July 3rd at the age of 84. I wanted to play your dad, Ethan Theoharis, speaking in 2008.
I think the history of the FBI raises very sharply that issue of accountability. And how do we, as we deal with different problems, ensure that the agency does not violate individual rights, or if we look at the essence of the American constitutional system, accepts the limited role of the government as defined by law. And the history of the FBI suggests that this problem has not been addressed.
Historian Ethan Theoharis. Liz Theoharis, can you talk about your dad's work? He also co-authored a book with your sister, the historian Jean Theoharis.
Yes, thanks so much. And thanks for playing that clip. It's so good to hear his voice and his analysis. We surely need it in this moment when there is an abuse of power going on, and when we are rising up to defend democracy, like I and so many people learned from my father. My father really helped to break open, expose the abuses of the FBI, and pave the way for generations of journalists and scholars and activists to both be able to access documents, figure out how to use FOIA to actually look at what the FBI was doing and is still continuing to do, and have a sense of how these federal intelligence agencies, the surveillance that has been going on for decades in our society, is being used to suppress activism rather than actually anything that's about defending democracy or making this country any better. And so his work lives on in his students, in the activists that continue to defend democracy and stand up for voting rights, that continue to do all the work he was so dedicated to. And I do encourage folks to check out his work, the 23 books he wrote, the guide for how you access your FBI files, and so much of his analysis that still is so prescient in our society today.
Interesting that you talk about the FBI surveillance. Are you concerned about Congress putting into place laws after the bloody insurrection that ultimately will be used against, well, people like you, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theoharis, against Reverend Barber, other people protesting, but this being done in the name of stopping an insurrection of Trump supporters?
Yes, indeed. I mean, what we are seeing in states across the country and on a federal level is a whole wave of anti-protest bills that are about targeting folks that are coming forward not to tear this society down, but for what we're calling a moral resurrection. And indeed, right now, folks should be very aware of these anti-protest laws and of the way that they're being used, to deny voting rights, to crack down on protesters that are calling out things like Line 3, just a whole host of the issues that are on this program today and every day are the very things that are under attack when actually what we need is to defend a democracy and defend our civil liberties and have the right to say what's not right that's going on, and then to build a movement to do something about it.
Again, our condolences, and thanks so much for being with us, Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris, co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe.